We good?
Yeah.
Like I say, I'm going to keep it about 20 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion. And the idea of the discussion isn't so everyone goes out the door and says, right, that's it, I'm an anarchist, but that we discuss ideas around the campaign, how best to do it. And this is just a particular perspective, it's the anarchist kind of perspective. And I'm speaking as an individual who's been an activist in Cork for a number of years, but at the moment I'm active in the Mahon Says No group, which is campaigning against the water tax, similar to the groups that most of you here are involved in around the city. So I'm going to divide it up kind of into three parts. The first part really is to talk a little about the context. A couple of years ago, if you picked up a newspaper or listened to a radio in this country, we were told quite definitively that the Irish don't protest and they accept their lot and we're passive people, etc. Now, anyone who knows any bit of history obviously knows that's was complete nonsense, but you might have felt a couple of years ago that things were after going kind of passive in the context of what was going on. So we're after coming through a period after the big crash in 2007. There was obviously a lot of anger, and at that point the trade union movement mobilised several huge demonstrations in Dublin and stuff like that of almost 100,000 people, etc. But nothing really came of that. There was no great fight back. The anger was dissipated, and ultimately it was funneled into a big vote for the alternative government. You mightn't see much of an alternative now, Fine Gael and Labour, who came to power on the back of that in 2011. And after that period, there was like a honeymoon period for the new government. Nothing much happened, and eventually the first kind of big, kind of widespread fight back we could see was around the household tax. And I have to refer to the household tax campaign because it sets the kind of context for what's happened in this campaign in a little bit, but also because some of the things that happened in that campaign obviously influenced how this campaign has developed and are important in terms of what the anarchist perspective is on things. The household tax campaign, CAHWT, campaign against household and water taxes. Interesting that, because the idea was that the campaign would evolve and grow and move on to fight the water tax ultimately. And it was initiated by a coalition of left-wing groups in the country, including anarchists and the various left-wing political parties, and built up a huge campaign infrastructure across the country, unevenly, it has to be said, and having a different character in different areas. And the reason it had different character in different areas, it depended on what the dominant kind of ideas in those areas were. So in some areas it was driven completely by political activists, had a very kind of structured hierarchical structure, and was under the control of particular political factions, and never kind of grew or developed beyond that, right? So in some areas it didn't exist. It existed on paper but didn't really exist. And one of the things that would illustrate that, Alan will remember, or anyone here who went to National Steering Committee meetings, we used to send delegates to Dublin to kind of coordinate things, people announcing themselves as representing different groups at it. But there was one particular delegate, this woman, and she used to always come in and she said she represented Tina McVeigh, and Tina McVeigh obviously isn't a physical place. It was a woman who's now a councillor in Dublin for the People Before Profit Alliance. So this woman was saying she was representing an individual as opposed to representing an area, which was the idea, was you represent areas, right? But obviously the message had been sent down to say, I represent wherever the woman is from, Ballyfermot or wherever. She just said Tina McVeigh. And so groups that didn't exist had votes. Big areas like might only have one or two delegates, and small areas might have one or two delegates. It was just very uneven and very there was a big fight over democracy within the campaign and democratising the campaign. And the principals agreed at the start of the campaign amongst the left was that the campaign would be democratic, would be local, would be based on non-payment and mobilisation of people against the household tax. And in some areas those agreements were very effective, and in other areas they weren't. And we'll see how those things influenced how this campaign, because I'm going to say a little bit about how the left has behaved in this campaign, and it's a reflection of what happened in the household tax campaign, which eventually was defeated, primarily because not enough people got involved in the campaign, and secondary because there was no strategy to deal with the revenue coming in and taking the money actively out of people's pockets, and that broke the necessary level of solidarity in terms of non-payment. There's also another important factor, I think, which comes to the fore in this campaign, is that the property tax only applied to privately owned houses. And a big feature of this campaign, we have to be honest about it, is the fact that the strongest areas probably in this campaign are council areas throughout the country. and a lot of those people wouldn't have been affected by the property tax. And that's definitely true in Mahon, where I live. Even though I was involved in the campaign against the property tax, I'm a council tenant. There was nothing in it for me, in sense I was doing a solidarity with people who were in that situation. And completely different campaign now in Mahon, because everyone's affected directly and everyone's become engaged at one level or another. So the household tax campaign was defeated, and then we see a period where I think a lot of people on the left were quite pessimistic about what could be achieved. And as a consequence, the water tax campaign, which was supposed to flow naturally from the household tax campaign, didn't really develop initially. The household tax campaign had splintered, in fact, and the various groups within it had either gone their own way or had taken what bit of the campaign they could control and used it to create an electoral bodies to contest elections. The anti-austerity political party essentially came out of the household tax campaign. That was the objective of the Socialist Party in there from the very start, obviously. It's in their general secretaries writing on their own page and stuff like that. But one of the positive things to come out of that campaign, and Candy Allen is here, is actually a few of the groups who were in the campaign stayed together and developed quite good democratic community-based campaigns that fought against austerity and prepared for the next round, if you like. And Cove is a very fine example of that, and the other one would be Ballyphehane Toker. And I'm using Cork because it's easier for us, obviously, to reference stuff that was happening in Cork. In the household tax campaign, there were between 20 and 27 local organised campaign groups throughout the city and county, varying in strength and varying in effectiveness. Rose and fell with the campaign, as you might expect, and a lot of people went, obviously, when it was defeated, kind of, alright, we're taking a break. Some groups stayed together. So the property tax campaign's over. There's a lull. There's an election in between. A lot of stuff with the property tax, I'm not going to go back because we've got too much old ground about fighting referendums and stuff like that. But that period ends. We have the elections, which were a big target for many of the left parties within the campaign. They came out of the way, and the government continues with the agenda of implementing the water tax. So at this point, basically, we can say the property tax campaign was defeated, thoroughly defeated. And the left was very slow to admit that, because it was a very bruising fight. To this day, you'll meet people who haven't paid the property tax simply because that campaign never at any point admitted its defeat and said, look, pay up and don't dig yourself any further into the hole. As a matter of fact, you'd have to challenge some people on the left to admit that the campaign's defeated. They still think the campaign's going on. I don't know how it's like the bin charges campaign is still going on or something. So then what happens next is that some of these groups, and specifically in Cork, the Ballyphehane Toker group, who'd stayed together, kept working away on the water tax campaign. And the first big break for the campaign, in actual fact, came when a housing estate in Toker decided not to allow the meters be installed. Now, the interesting thing about that whole issue around the meters is that a lot of people on the left thought opposing the meters was an unrealistic ask of people, because it actually involved a direct confrontation with workers and possibly the Gardaí. And people felt, after the defeat of the property testing, people weren't really up for that. But surprise, surprise, as usually happens, working class people surprise their political leaders and actually are a bit more militant and a bit more up for it than we expect. And the Ballyphehane Toker group, who'd been canvassing areas around Toker, eventually clicked with a group in Ashbrook, and they went out and refused to allow the meters in, and it became a huge media event. And people remember that period at the start of the summer last year. It was on the news regularly, the confrontations and physical opposition to the meters going in. This was copied by another few estates in the area, and that example was picked up by many little community-based campaigning groups around the country, particularly in Dublin. And that example is what gave, if you like, impetus to the campaign. Now, other aspects of the campaign already existed. Right to Water already existed, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And the We Won't Pay campaign, which is essentially the Socialist Party campaign, existed. But the real campaign, in a sense, was started by these communities that physically stopped the meters going in and said basically there'll be no meters and there'll be no water tax, and we're not going to allow you to put the meters in, and put themselves at the front of that. In other words, they didn't wait for someone to come and do it for them. So from an anarchist perspective, one of the most positive things that's developed in this campaign is this community pillar, if you like. So essentially there's three kind of pillars in the campaign. We're going to just touch on that briefly before getting back to the community, because that's where the interesting stuff is happening. The Right to Water campaign is essentially a coalition, a kind of top-down coalition, let's be honest, right, that was established by 5 trade unions and a number of political organisations. 5 trade unions who'd be outside of the kind of Labour ambit at this point, completely disillusioned with the direction they've taken. And Unite, the Communication Workers Union, OPATSI, Mandate. They slip up in my mind every now and then, but there's a list of 5 unions and 5 big unions that initiated that campaign and kind of funded it. Their centre of unity is around opposition to the water tax, but beyond that, they don't really have an agreement in terms of strategy, apart from the idea of some sort of political strategy and mobilising large numbers of people for marches. Don't have any real problem with any of the stuff they do. The mobilisation for marches were very, very positive. And I remember when the first march was called, some of us were saying, well, you know, if 20,000-30,000 people come along, that'd be a good, respectable showing, etc., etc. And as was 100,000 people or more showed up. So many that, in fact, it's almost impossible to estimate. That's always the sign, it's probably more than 100,000 people. It's phenomenal. It took everyone by surprise. Everyone by surprise, let's be honest about it, was really surprised by this. And the impetus that provided was it gave a huge burst of confidence to everybody who was organising against the water tax. And people who were a bit jaded by the previous campaign, or people who hadn't been active before in any sort of politics whatsoever, saw, well, you know, there's lots of people willing to fight this. Maybe I'm going to take a risk on this one. Maybe this one I'll get involved in, you know, because it can be a big step. We all know, you know, the sacrifice you have to make. So that's the Right to Water. That's what it's done. We'll talk a little about the politics of the Right to Water afterwards. There's lots of competing factions, etc. in it. Then there's the political organisations of various hues who are opposed to the water tax, both on in terms of their policy positions, but also in terms of their activity. I'm not going to say much about them. You know, they have their own campaigns. They're doing their own thing by and large. They were a little bit negative around the anti-metering stuff. I think people were won to it by example more than anything else, how successful it was. And then the most important pillar, if you like, is the community pillar. And I think nearly everyone who's here is involved in some way in the community-based groups that are fighting the water tax. Now, the positive thing about that is that the methodology being used by communities to fight the water tax are all things that would seem completely natural to anarchists and to serious kind of activists about how you oppose something. No one's gone out and said, I'm an anarchist, and here's my list of how I'm going to oppose the water tax. People have actually reached this through looking at good example, through self-organising and coming to those conclusions themselves. And, you know, and an awful lot of the communication of the ideas has been horizontal. In other words, it hasn't come from someone on high saying basically this is the list of how you oppose it. It's been Ballyfian Talker do this, Dublin says no, copy it, Cove looks at that model, copies it. You know, it's been copied horizontally by and large by people looking at good example and sharing the information, ideas, and networks, informal networks through workplaces and family and stuff. A lot of the information you get is coming that way. And the phenomena, of course, of social media has been an important way of conveying these ideas, something quite new in a sense. You know, 10 years ago, I don't think Facebook was that important. Now it's hugely, information travels extremely fast. And has also allowed us to dismantle, obviously, the lies of the mainstream media. So the positive aspects of that campaign thus far, we have to say that the direct action aspect of it really appeals to people in the sense that rather than waiting for anyone to do anything, you go out and you stop the meters going, you stand on the stop clock, you stand in front of the trucks, you refuse them access into your community, and the community mobilises together to do that. And that's a very different thing from voting for someone to go to the Dáil and repeal the legislation, or writing a letter to the paper, or phoning Joe Duffy. You know, you're actually taking it into your own hands in a sense. That's a self-activity in a sense, people going out, self-organising in their communities and going and doing that kind of stuff. Then there's the aspects of it, of the nature of the organising. And I'll reference Cove here for a very good democratic structure in their campaign in terms of local community delegates and stuff like that. They're at it a bit longer because they stayed together after property tax. But where communities have organised, they've generally, the structures, if the community organises themselves, have remained pretty democratic. No, that's not 100% true, because it obviously varies from area to area, and if you have a strong man kind of character in an area, that can sometimes dominate it. But by and large, within communities, it has stayed pretty democratic, and it's because it's right on people's doorstep. And it's very hard to have a conversation on your green in front of your house that everyone doesn't participate in. And that's been extremely instructive and very useful, in the sense that it's created a grassroots democracy that hasn't really existed within campaigns in this country for quite some time. Now, there were aspects of it previously. I'd say Concerned Parents Against Drugs had an aspect of it in Dublin, and there have been aspects of it around various smaller campaigns in communities and stuff like that. But this is on a large scale. So in communities right across the country, you get people organising on their doorstep, maybe initiated by somebody from a local anti-watertax group, but essentially them taking control of it at their doorsteps and implementing their policy. That's really inspiring kind of stuff. The other thing that's very noticeable in the campaign, people remember, only a couple of days ago or a couple of weeks ago, we were picketing Garda stations in Cork. On 2 occasions actually, and there was pickets and Garda stations in Cove and Middleton and Youghal and other places. And that's because people have an instinctive desire to show solidarity with campaigners throughout the country doing the same kind of thing. Even if we don't agree with everything they're doing, we know that they're on the same side as us, and if they're coming under the pressure from the state, we're going to stand with them. And that's been really inspiring also, that people don't feel isolated in their own communities. We can say social media is definitely part of it. Certainly it's not RT that's helping us, or the newspapers. It's because we're communicating ourselves between these groups, and the links between groups that have been built up as a consequence of that have strengthened that solidarity, because solidarity can be based on the abstract. In other words, I don't know any Palestinians, but I show solidarity to Palestinians. But when you know the people personally, you have a relationship with them, or you know somebody who knows them, it strengthens the bond all the more, and you feel more emotionally, if you linked to their troubles into yours. And so we have that huge level of solidarity across the country, even where there are disagreements, like I say, about strategy and tactics. But the most important element, I suppose, all those things taken into account, is the class content of the campaign. And this has very, very characteristically been a working class campaign, and that it has meant that the language used and the dialogue between people is something that is quite inaccessible to a lot of the political elite in the country. I think there's someone reading that the other day in one of the newspapers, a sociologist ironically, talking about the language that people are speaking, the way people are relating to each other, isn't accessible to the liberal elite within the media, or within the government, or within the intelligentsia, if you like. In other words, they can't relate to it because they never deal with people at that level or in our communities, by and large. And it's also a very empowering thing, because suddenly people discover that you might be married, you might not have a great deal of money, you might be dependent on social housing, you might feel a lot of power, but suddenly you have all this power, and it comes from collective action. And that's a very inspiring thing, and a very revolutionary thing for people to start thinking that way, that our power comes from each other acting collectively, and that we can achieve certain things by doing that. And of course that has a knock-on effect in all sorts of ways, in terms of our outlook about how society is organised and about how we can bring about change. And of course anarchists want a complete revolutionary change of society, as Kevin has outlined earlier, and that's a big demand. And you can't say water tax this week, revolution next week. Of course it doesn't work like that, but we have to welcome the fact that lots and lots of working class people are building a huge level of self-confidence, are showing solidarity with other working class people, are acting in a democratic fashion, are using direct action methods, etc. There aren't tens of thousands of people suddenly calling themselves anarchists or anything, but there are tens of thousands of people now who know that as a class we have this power, who know that organising it in this manner gives us this power, and who will do it again around other issues within our communities and in the broader society. And that can only be a positive thing that all of us can welcome. So now we're going to do a small little bit of criticism of left organisation, if I'm not running too long time-wise, Kevin. No. Okay. So in that context, what's the most important thing that anarchists can do in the campaign? Well, I mean, basically, we go along, we participate in the campaign, obviously, because in our communities we participate in the campaign and we advocate the sort of methods that are effective and working in other areas, and we push for democracy and stuff like that. We don't demand that we wave red and black flags, or we join the organisation. That's not how you participate. You participate as a member of the community, and you just do your best to help those things go along. But what we have to argue against, we have to argue against the kind of ideas that would demobilise the campaign. And one of the big things I think is that in danger of demobilising the campaign is a big push by certain parts of the left for all this effort and energy and time that's going into the campaign now to be shifted into the idea of electing people to the dial to sort out the problem. And there's going to be an election and people are going to get elected to the dial. That's a fact. And there'll probably be more left-wing people than there were before or whatever elected to the dial. But really, is that where it's at? The thing that's given us the power currently, we've identified as the fact that we've organised as communities collectively, that we're organising a mass non-payment campaign that will show us a huge, powerful movement, that we're organising grassroots in our communities, democratic structures. And the worst thing, in my opinion, that could happen to that is that all that energy and all that power is transferred to a few individuals representing us in the dial to argue against the water tax. I think that would be an immense demobilisation of of the potential power of this movement. This movement should stay separate from that, in my opinion. Whatever disagreements we might have about electoralism, we should stay separate. This movement should be a separate thing from that. It should be about working class communities mobilising and defending their areas and creating structures that can challenge whatever the state brings against us in the future. And I think that whether you're into fighting elections or not, that movement will be the engine that could drive change in the society. I don't think that societies, that it taking the power, taking the fuel of that engine and putting it into an electoral thing will benefit the campaign. And I have to say, this is my final word on it, that when it comes to a campaign like this, the attitude you have to take as a left-wing activist is that the class interest has to be put first. In other words, the narrow idea of your political organisation growing, gaining new members, gaining new influence. Yes, we all want to spread our ideas, we all want to gain new members, we all want to expand our organisations, but the key issue here is to advance the class interest. And the class interest clearly is about defeating the water tax and creating this movement and demonstrating the power of working class self-activity and direct action, direct democracy to achieve that. And that gain will be a gain for the whole class. And I think that's what I'd like to see come out of this. And if, as a consequence, there's one or two more anarchists in the world, that's great. But a defeat for the ruling class by the working class on that basis would be such a boost to us that it would make everything, the next campaign, the next fight you have, so much easier. I think we'll call it that.